Whether you're a diehard sports fan, a hopeless romantic, or a comedy aficionado, the Xfinity 10G network was made for streaming it all. Worry less about buffering when streaming your favorite shows, movies, or live sports, and enjoy a better way to watch. Xfinity gives you a reliable connection for streaming, plus all the entertainment you love all in one place. Fear not, because now you can finally sit back, relax, and stream your favorite entertainment and sports like never before with the Xfinity 10G network.
Want the same expert advice you get from the pros in the store while shopping online at DiscountTire.com? Meet Treadwell, your personal online tire guide that matches you with the perfect tire for your vehicle. Get your best match in 1 minute or less with Treadwell by Discount Tire.
This is Jen from Yardley, Pennsylvania. Do what the cool kids do and get exclusive podcasts and more at patreon.com/partnersincrimemedia, just like I do.
I'm Rebecca Lavoie, and this is Crime Writers On. Crime Writers On is the original true crime review podcast that digs into true crime, pop culture, other podcasts. And this week, for years, young women have been murdered and disappeared in a Mexican border town. Is it the work of a serial killer or part of a larger conspiracy? We'll talk about the podcast Forgotten Women of Juárez. Then a Pentecostal preacher is accused of trying to kill his wife with a serpent. We'll review HBO Max's Alabama Snake. Join me to get that done and more is my real-life husband and true crime co-author, former TV journalist and love of my life, Kevin Flynn. Hello, Kevin.
Merry Christmas, Rebecca.
Happy holidays, Kevin.
Happy holidays.
It's the war on the holidays, Kevin. Also with us is journalist, true crime author, former defense investigator, licensed private investigator, and certified pet investigator, Laura Bricker. Hello, Laura.
Hello. Yeah, I have a big cat case I'm going to be going out to learn more about this weekend.
Cannot wait. Maybe we can talk about that in the after show. And finally with us is our captain of woke cynicism, the author behind the noir novels known as the City Trilogy and host of the Strange Arrivals podcast with iHeartMedia, and our Patreon book club host, Toby Ball. Hello, Toby.
Hello, Rebecca.
How's everyone doing? I know that we always talk about weather on this podcast, which is boring and off topic. Is it not? So cold out. Toby, go.
Yeah, it's pretty cold, and we're about to get a foot of snow. So.
Yes, it's so exciting. Right, Laura?
It's cold enough to freeze your titties off, Rebecca.
Wow. Is that what happened to me?
It's pretty cold.
Kevin, how are you doing? You staying warm?
I'm staying warm, Rebecca.
Yeah.
Nothing like the bright, hot lights in this studio that
I
just
know.
get hotter the longer we talk.
It's insane. We use hot water bottles in our bed because I secretly live in 1875. And I just got these Harris tweed covers for the hot water bottles. And yesterday, Kevin was complaining the heat was not dispersing quickly enough through the Harris tweed. That is how cold it is in New Hampshire right now. So yes, that is our lifestyle, and thus ends the weather report for this week. Should we start a podcast now?
Yeah.
All right, let's get it done. Leading off.
Right across the border from where we stood, there were young women who worked in American-owned factories in the Mexican city of Ciudad Juárez. And they were being killed with horrific brutality. The victims were often found half naked, dumped in the desert. Some were found in mass graves with strange symbols left on their bodies.
Journalists Oz Woloshyn and Monica Ortiz Uribe investigate a string of femicides in a Mexican border town dating back to the 1990s, which claimed the lives of hundreds of women. The crimes all have the hallmarks of a serial killer and attract the attention of the FBI in El Paso.
There is a real possibility that an American or someone who is residing on our side of the border is conducting these murders.
But in a city where drug cartels control everything, including the police, why do the Mexicans show so little interest in solving the cases? Why have scapegoats been coerced into confessions? Were the women snatched by a psychotic killer, or were they targeted by a network of people who knew where to find them and knew they could get away with it?
The young ladies were putting their personal data into the questionnaires, and their pictures were taken. So it became very easy for someone at another end whoever this information was being forwarded to let this operate as a catalog.
Forgotten, Women of Juárez takes us from the Mexican streets and American factories where the victims lived and worked to the cops, attorneys, and journalists on both sides of the border who are threatened for seeking answers. The podcast explores how organized crime and a corrupt government aren't just stifling the investigation into the deaths, but how they might also be taking part in them. Now, spoiler alert, we will be talking about significant plot points from Forgotten Women of Juárez. So if you want to remain spoiler-free and just get our thumbs up or thumbs down review, go to the estimated time code in our show notes. Toby Ball, do you remember Serial Season 2, how Sarah Koenig said in Episode 1, like, we're going to start here, but then we're going to be zooming out?
Yes.
I personally feel like Forgotten the Women of Juárez is the most zoomy outy of any podcast we've ever listened to. What do you think of this podcast that starts with one victim and going to visit her mother and talking about what happened to her, and ends with the role of global capitalism and the global economy and international banking and American corporate greed in the final episode? Like, that is quite a zoom out, right?
Yeah. Well, I think, I guess I came into it knowing a little bit about the fact that there were, scores of murdered women in Juárez. And so I knew it was going to obviously expand from there. And I think what the podcast does really well is to give you the context in which all this stuff happens and why that makes it so difficult to even really investigate, which is sort of this confluence of a lot of money, both legal and illegal, in the form of American factories, and then also the drug trade, but, capitalism, essentially. And that along with these very, very poor workers who go from just very difficult conditions to, they describe these factories where they work as being like the safest place that they will be. So what's the consequence of that? And one of them is clearly that the lives of the workers, and particularly these young women, just don't seem to have much value within the system.
Kevin, what do you think of the big zoom out that we get in the podcast?
I hadn't thought of it as a zoom out like you did, but you did a good job explaining that. I just sort of felt like it just took the whole story from one point and brought it all the way back around again.
Yeah.
In a very good way, because it does start like with, the crime. And it does have like all the hallmarks of a serial killer case. And so your mindset is there. Like, okay, what's going on? Juárez has, this very bad reputation as a drug cartel city. And it's like, that's the backdrop for this serial killer story. And it took me sort of halfway through this before I gave up on the idea, no, this isn't a serial killer. But it goes from, some of the crimes and the disappearances of women to the plights of them as low-paid laborers, and then you look at the local police, and then the government corruption, and then you get to the corporate culpability, and then right back to the cartels in the beginning. And then in the story-wise, you go back to the, that family. So I just thought it was a really great way of sort of waltzing the listener away from what the obvious thing is.
Right.
Right? It's like if you're going to say, people are dying mysteriously in Chernobyl. Well, I mean, it's like you immediately go, well, could it be the radiation from the... But if they like set you off believing that, no, that's just the backdrop.
Yeah.
And not in an unfair way.
Yeah.
But just sort of placing it there. And I was really impressed with sort of the way they told the story, and they told it very in depth.
I have a follow-up for you, because I kept finding myself thinking this. It does start with a serial killer teaser, which I remember being a lot in the media at the time, which was like, is this a serial killer? The women were cut. They had all these like markings on them. They
were targeted.
Yeah, all that
stuff. They were hunted, yeah.
So do you think, it's so funny because the myth of the serial killer, I mean, I don't say the myth, there are serial killers, but there's sort of like this also like pop culture myth of serial killers. And the probable explanations, which I believe there's more than one, which we'll talk about. Like, I don't think it's just one thing. I think it might be multiple things. The myth of the serial killer is fantastical and rare, yet for some reason that's almost easier to believe than the idea of what's actually going on, which is like systemic predation. Did you find yourself thinking like, I want it to be a serial killer, not because that's better, but because that's easier to cope with?
Yeah, I didn't want to believe in a big conspiracy.
Right.
Right. Sort of Occam's razor, sort of the simplest solution is probably, the most likely. And so the idea that this was the work of a killer or maybe separate killers working in tandem or not, as opposed to the idea that
the police are in on it and everyone's in on it.
Right. The cartels control the police, and that in the end, it's just a big sport where instead of a bunch of stockbrokers going to the strip club, the cartel celebrates by kidnapping women, having violent sex with them, killing them, and then burying them in mass graves.
The cartel and also these corporate types.
I'm still not like convinced that Lee Iacocca or whoever else was involved in a murder at a snuff party.
Right.
But, it's certainly there's a lot. It could be all of these things.
It could be more than one. It's so funny you talk about Occam's razor. I feel like this podcast does a good job of disabusing our notion of Occam's razor. For us, it's a serial killer here in our comfortable New Hampshire home. In Juárez, the Occam's razor is cartels and powerful rich men. That's the Occam's razor there. So, Laura, journalism is front and center in this podcast. We have many journalists involved in it, but the two that are front and center are Monica and, of course, Diane Washington Valdez. And we hear about their experience reporting on this story. And the story that really sticks out with me is this idea that, like, you wear cowboy boots every day because they're your favorite shoes because you walk around in the sand and you don't want to get sand, inside your socks. So you always wear these cowboy boots. But then you've been reporting on this story so long and you've been threatened so much that you think.
But I would think twice about putting those cowboy boots on because I would think, shoot, what if someone stuck me into the back of their trunk? It would be very uncomfortable to be wearing these cowboy boots stuffed in somebody's trunk.
That was one really stellar, stunning detail. But what did you think just sort of about the role of journalism in this podcast, the central role that journalism had in this story of taking it from maybe serial killer to very clearly probably something else?
Yeah. So, it really, as I was listening to this, we've had cutbacks at our local paper. We've been seeing newspapers around the country laying off employees. And I think listening to this, I was just struck by the role that journalists can play in bringing something like this to the forefront when, as you're listening to this, even the devil's lawyer couldn't do something about it and decided to go to the media to get the story out there. But I was really just listening to this thinking, this is absolutely freaking terrifying what these reporters are going through to get the story, knowing they're in danger, knowing they're at risk, knowing they're not safe, but still so dedicated to making sure that story gets out there. And the other one there was the man, Alfredo, and the story of his that really, I was just like, holy crap, was, when he is basically marked and he knows he needs to get back across the border into the U.S. and he's like running and he doesn't know where to go. And he goes to this lawyer's office and basically like hides in the back of his vehicle to get back out.
All these things are going through my mind. And I'm also thinking, what if Dante's in on this? What if he's not taking me to the bridge? What if he's taking me somewhere? What if he's taking me to the cops? And then I see him on the phone and he just sounds so nonchalant. It's just another normal day.
I just felt the terror that they must feel when they know I'm doing my job, but there are eyes all around. I think that was the thing that struck me, is like, even when they're there reporting and they're maybe not aware of who knows they're there, somebody's always watching them. Somebody knows they're there. Somebody knows what they're doing. And it's different than being a war. I mean, like, you've got like war correspondents and they kind of know the danger of going to war. But this is, to me, was just so terrifying, knowing that anywhere you turn, somebody could actually be the enemy, and knowing that the police were not safe to go to. I mean, that was the other thing, is like, so you're there and you need help, you can't even go to the freaking police. So it was pretty terrifying. But I think, when you learn that this all happened, I mean, some of this was going back to like, was it 2003 when one of them started reporting? A long time that this story has been in the works. Just amazing.
Yeah, I just keep thinking, Kevin, about the fact that all of their sources kept getting killed. The devil's lawyer was killed. The two lawyers, the father and son who were defending the bus driver, the son was murdered. They called it an assassination. Then later we find out the father was also killed. The journalists become very reliable narrators in this story, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say the paranoia quotient is very high among the people in the podcast. Remember, they were like, went down to Juárez and they're walking on Mina Street, and they're like, oh, over there you've got, people are looking out. And
Those are the lookouts.
Yeah. It just seemed like they certainly felt like all eyes were always on them, and there were these nefarious forces at work.
That's a guy that's trying to spook us.
He's mimicking a gun with his hand. Yeah. Should we get out of it, you think?
Early on, you're like, oh, yeah, this is serious. It's a dangerous place. But you sort of, that whole paranoia just builds up in the listener, too, as you go along. But you're right. Laura's right that thank God for journalists, because they seem to be the only ones doing, like, real investigations that aren't tainted by corruption.
Until they don't. Because they're too scared.
Until they're too scared to keep going. Yeah.
Diana Washington is an incredible character. Monica and Oz talked to her. She's this woman who admits her book sucked because she just wanted to finish it quickly and be done with the story. Her friend at the newspaper was murdered, like her friend and reporting partner. Like, she was threatened over and over and over again. I mean, the guy from Dallas, was the Dallas Morning News, the newspaper there, like, he was doing the story. Dallas is not super close to Juárez, obviously, as El Paso, but he was being threatened. I don't know. Toby, I mean, we just listened to, and I ranked as one of the best podcasts from last year, Canary, which is kind of all about how hard it is for a reporter to actually get to the bottom of or verify facts in a story. Doesn't this podcast take that idea to a whole new level?
Yeah. Well, because I don't think anybody in Canary was worried about getting killed.
Yeah.
No. Yeah.
But yeah, the whole thing is kind of it's a messy story. I mean, they lay it out pretty well to show you how difficult it is to kind of get a handle on what's going on and the different things that it could be. It's kind of a stunning thing in and of itself that you've got all these different forces that you could potentially think of as being the force that would do these terrible things and then kill all these women. So, yeah, I don't know. I found it very compelling. It makes Juárez seem like such a complicated place and not in a good way.
Yeah. Kevin, there's a whole law enforcement aspect of this podcast that I really like. I think one of the strongest aspects of this podcast is that they start with victims, but they also are completely including the voice of law enforcement. There's that wonderful character, Oscar Minor, the medical examiner who, was in and then he was out, but he secretly kept all the files because he knew they'd be corrupted. But they also have this entire FBI storyline. There's the previous second in command at the El Paso FBI. But then there's this very complicated story about Hardrick Crawford, who was the agent in charge, the AIC, of the El Paso Bureau, who came in. He was chosen because he was an outsider. He didn't want the job. He chose to be outspoken about the murders. He called them out for being horrible crimes. He called the Mexican authorities out for not wanting to solve them. Then he finds himself in a situation where he is taken down. And the reporting in the podcast suggests that either he made bad decisions or was maybe walking the line of being corrupt, or the State Department and or the corporate powers that be took him down on purpose because he was bringing attention to the American businesses in Mexico and their culpability in these crimes. That was a complicated story. I'm curious to know what you think of him and what you think of that storyline.
Well, I did like his passion for the victims. It's a crime in Mexico, but he definitely acknowledged that there's an American interest in this case. Certainly that, Americans have resources that the Mexicans don't. That could help solve the case, whether it's, behavioral profilers or DNA testing or, advanced forensics. But you end up finding out that, the Mexican police, self-sabotage the scene. There's a great story
on purpose.
about the rolling over the body, and there are fresh cigarette butts, underneath the body. And it's like they're continuing to sabotage the crime scenes because they really don't want them to be solved. And, you find out later, it's because the cartels have an interest in these crimes. So his passion for that is really interesting. I think in the end, he should have seen, the end of his time there coming because he did make some poor decisions.
Yeah.
Which included his wife taking a job in Mexico at a racetrack that's run by the cartel.
Yeah.
It was not a good look at all.
Whether or not it was innocent or not.
Yeah, and I'm sure they didn't get into it whether somebody from the racetrack approached her and said, how would you like to, it's
Sounds
just,
like that's what happened, yeah.
Yeah, it was very naive to think that wasn't going to be problematic and that he was socializing with the cardinal who, even the church is corrupt with the cartels and, whatever. But if he wants to say, well, I think I scared people at the State Department. Yeah, I'm sure there were people who didn't like the PR aspect of it, but he's also the FBI. Talking about doing is one thing. If they really, had a concern, they wouldn't have him doing things, right? Yeah. Investigating. So I think he just was hoisted by his own petard.
I'm just saying, I think that partially is true, but I also don't understand how anybody can know what they know in 2020 and not believe, at least a little bit, that it could have been someone in power in the United States, like a corporate type who's the CEO of GE or Lear or one of these huge companies, that didn't call their senator, who's also their best friend, and say, hey, this guy's making us look really bad. Do something about it. To me, it's not difficult to draw those lines, especially knowing what we know about how corruption works. I'm not saying that's definitely what happened, but I also want to believe he wouldn't be giving interviews about this if there were things to trace to him that were like, no, you were corrupt. We can see this $200,000 in your bank account. It's not like that stuff was completely absent. He was taken down. Toby, I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, I don't know if he was in reality corrupt, but I do think, like, if you're assessing his position after his wife takes that spot, that it does seem as though he becomes corruptible.
Yeah.
So I think,
or easy to blame, right? Easy to pin.
It's a security concern.
Yeah.
I think. So whether you go to jail for it or just get shipped out of El Paso, once she took that job, it seemed like that was kind of an untenable position.
Yeah. That was a mistake, even if it was not on purpose.
Yeah. It surprises me that he would be that naive, and his explanation for it seemed, again, it's kind of he's leaning on you believing that he could be either naive or so pure as a driven snow that he can't imagine anybody thinking that he would do something wrong by doing that. I don't know. When I was listening to it, I'm like, dude, this just doesn't seem like a good choice.
I love the way the podcast handled it, though. I love the way they had his friend Frank and being like, I went to his house and I was like, what the fuck? They were very even-handed with that story, which I really appreciated. I tend to be more on the side of like Crawford's sense. I mean, he made missteps, which he didn't admit, which he should have admitted, that he made like clear missteps. I tend to believe he was taken down only because there's nothing in the story that would make me disbelieve it. Laura, what do you think?
Well, I was going to say the setup, I think, set him up as being sort of naive and maybe just poor judgment. Because the setup was that, like, my wife has always been in my shadow and I've been this big FBI guy or whatever. And then she had an opportunity. So, like, I let her take it sort of thing. I just felt like that when that was the lead into it, I felt like you should have known better.
Yeah, it's a bad look.
Yes, it was. It didn't look good, but I tend to agree with you, Rebecca. I don't think necessarily that he was corrupt. I think that he didn't use good judgment, and he was a problem for them. I mean, I guess based on everything we heard in this podcast about the corruption, which is everywhere, apparently. I mean, it was astounding just on every level. I would be more inclined to believe that somebody within that corrupt system saw him as a threat and found a way to take him out.
Laura, I have a quick question for you and then a real question for you.
Okay.
Like me, were you super pissed that any job would turn someone away from their shift for being 2 minutes late?
Not a podcast.
That is some inhumane ass working conditions. By the way, the Lear company, I was waiting. When they first said that, I was like, I want to know what company that was. Later they said it was Lear. All I could think was there's an American company with a factory, a Maquilo, they're called, and their regular practice is if you're 2 minutes late, you just can't work that day. What the actual fuck?
It's control. I feel like control was such a central theme in here, like control of this male dominated society and crimes and everything. But 2 minutes, I'm like, oh my gosh. I mean, this sounds like conversations we have in our house where I'm like, when you're in the real world, if you're late to work, like you're out of school, you're going to get fired. But 2 minutes is like, I could see that if you're working at some sort of a federal government contract job where you have like high security, but not in this case.
All right. So, Laura, my other question for you that I want to go talk to everybody about is I think that it's really hard when a story like this that's so sweeping and there are hundreds and hundreds of victims. It is very hard to actually put a face and voice to victims when the victims are so many and the crimes are so varied. I mean, they have a lot in common, but they're also a lot of different crimes, bodies in different places, different kinds of, situations. I think this podcast dealt extremely well with telling victim stories and getting into sort of the life and families of the victims. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that going into this podcast had a leg up because such extensive relationship making, reporting type work had already been done by the three journalists that are really, the main sources in terms of telling the story and narrating what they'd done. So they had existing relationships with the families of some of these victims. But I think that the story that really struck me was the family that we're following of the victim where there were, the multiple siblings, and we're hearing from the mother, and we learn about how the father took his own life. And that was awful. And it was just, I think when you're in this situation and you're hearing that, it doesn't sound like there's going to be justice. It's nobody, the police are not even there to help you. These women, these young women, these girls that have been murdered are, people that they're thinking nobody's going to actually demand justice for. So when you hear this story about the father reaching that point, I think that really just drove home just this feeling of helplessness that the families of the victims feel in the face of what was going on.
Toby, it's a difficult needle to thread, right? You're telling a story about globalism, NAFTA, mass graves, and, this sweeping set of crimes took a place across decades. And I found myself thinking, this is a hard needle to thread, making it personal. Do you think the podcast succeeded in that regard?
Yeah, no, I think they did a really good job. The individual stories were poignant and devastating. And I think that's an important thing to do, too, because, again, I think part of the issue is that these young women are seen as anonymous. So I think it was really important. I don't think you can honor all of them, but you honor them through examples. I'm pretty sure that Roberto Bolaño, he's a Chilean author he died a number of years ago, but got really hit. But he's got a book, I think it's called 2066. And I think one of the chapters is just about all of the women who at that point had been killed in Juárez.
Yeah.
When I take a look at this podcast and think about how complicated the story is and, what they were trying to do in the course of, 10 episodes, it seems very daunting. And I just think they do it incredibly well.
Yeah, it's really ambitious, right, Kevin? It starts small. Yeah. I think about even the episode with police corruption and the scapegoating of those two bus drivers.
Oh,
that
my God.
could have been its own podcast, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And they ended up doing it in one episode.
Yeah. Toby used a word that just made a lot of stuff click for me. We talked about how complicated this story is. And I think less was done in the nobody zone. But I could follow women of Juárez a lot better. And I think it has just sort of just the storytelling style and the things that they got into and the nature of the story.
The writing
and the different people involved. it really, held my attention. And it is a very complicated story. Yeah, it isn't. It would be nice if it were just a serial killer. We could get into that. But having it go in all these different directions, it's like, wow, this is really complicated.
I just want to ask you one quick question before we do our reviews, Kevin. Yeah. It occurred to me listening to I listened to all of it and I kept thinking this, but then I really realized it in episode 8 or 9. Monica is billed as the co-host. Mm-hmm. It's actually a reporter two-way with her in many ways. And the structure of the podcast reminds me a lot of, what's the Kim Goldman podcast? The OJ one, where she talks about her sister's murder. It reminds me a lot of that podcast where she's the primary source, but she's not reading narration off a script. She's being asked questions by the host. And I'm just curious, I found that effective. I was also very glad that she was given top billing on the show when clearly she was not writing the narration or reading the narration. She was basically a subject of the narration. Do you think the structure of this worked? I guess is what I'm asking you.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't have listed her as, number 2.
But she introduces herself in the opening credits.
Right. I mean, Oz is sort of, okay, so she's there's 1 and 1A.
Yeah.
But yeah, she is not only a reporter host who's pulling information out from others, but she's also in a position where she can add to the discussion her own stories. And then she also brings in Diana, who's the authority,
the badass
on this, on this case. And then, other journalists. It was really interesting to just sort of see this whole thing laid out. And for me to go from, okay, who's the killer, to eventually getting around to everybody else, no, this actually is something bigger and more complicated.
All right. Well, let's do what we do. Let's let our listeners know. Should they check out Forgotten Women of Juárez? The podcast is totally out. There are 10 episodes plus bonus episodes available for listening right now. Laura Bricker, I'm going to start with you. Thumbs up or thumbs down for Forgotten Women of Juárez?
I'm going thumbs up on this. Now, I will say we listened to this in a pretty short time frame because of our schedule for this podcast. So I would suggest, spreading out your listening so you could really kind of think about it between episodes, because it was 10 episodes. But I think, you go in thinking that this story is going to be, who did this and why did they do this? And is there justice? Is somebody going to be held responsible? And I think at the end of this, it became more of sort of a philosophical question for me. It was more sort of bearing witness to what happened to the women in this podcast. And I think this is really timely, and it's extremely well reported, and it really highlights the value of good journalism, which I feel like we need to shout out anytime we can with newsrooms and news organizations downsizing around the country. This story is an example of the power of journalism, and I think based on that just really, for me, gave it a big thumbs up.
Toby Ball, what about you? Thumbs up or thumbs down for Forgotten Women of Juárez?
Well, I'm going to echo Laura about having to listen to it too fast, because it's a very complex podcast. There's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of forces at play. I think it was remarkably good. It's hard not to be kind of discouraged just about the way global capitalism, I guess. I mean, I kind of feel like this is a specific, particular story, but it's sort of emblematic of situations that I think occur around the world, not with this many deaths, but with that kind of attitude towards the lives of people in poorer countries. So there's just a lot to think about, but I highly recommend it.
Kevin Flynn.
I'm going thumbs up. This was a story that, started off small and did a great job of bringing all the other elements that, were teased out. It's called Forgotten Women of Juárez. It could just be called Juárez, with a big exclamation point after, right? I can see the big bold letters, because it really is about this community in a way that you're not all hokey, we're going to do something that's going to show what this town is all about. It's really about how this city is intertwined with these crimes, and whether or not there can be justice, or whether or not it can even be stopped. And one of the later episodes, they make the point about holding powerful men accountable.
Yeah.
And you can't do that in the U.S. It's so difficult. Imagine how it is in Mexico.
Right.
when all the cards are stacked against you. So it's not what I thought it was going to be, but it certainly is a fantastic achievement. So thumbs up.
Yeah, I loved this podcast. And just like Laura, I wish I had not listened to the whole thing in a week. It just felt too condensed and I didn't need time to think. I mean,
that's nobody else's problem.
No, that's
crime writers.
That's an us thing. That's an us thing, not a podcast makers thing. I have found myself, since finishing this podcast, walking around my house and looking at everything in my home and my car and my closet, thinking like, what do I own that was touched by someone in Juárez? You know, whether it's the pocket of my jeans, as they say, or the sensor that makes the gear shift in my car work, or the switch on my blender. Everything we do make touch, at some point, some piece of it came through Juárez. And I just kind of found myself thinking like, is a woman whose life is in jeopardy, or who died, possibly somebody who was involved in the making of my blender, which sounds like crazy, except the podcast does take you there. It's the culpability of capitalism pretty much directly leads to the murders and rapes of hundreds and hundreds of women. I have two only tiny criticisms of the podcast. One is I feel like the scope of the story is a perfect onion, beautifully told. I don't necessarily feel like, as close as they got to the victims, like I really did want to know how many graves, how many people, what is the actual scope of the crime. It's a little bit of a missing piece there. My only other tiny production criticism is that whoever is editing the speech tracking on this podcast, don't worry about the ums and don't paste everything over with breaths. There's just too much cleaning up that you can actually hear. That is a very, very tiny quibble in an otherwise really outstanding achievement. I really recommend Forgotten Women of Juárez. And I'm hoping, Kevin, I know you said Juárez could have been the title. I'm hoping that Forgotten will be a series and there will be another story as sweeping and great as this. Oz, Monica, mwah, great job for me. Thumbs up for Forgotten Women of Juárez.
Whether you're a diehard sports fan, a hopeless romantic, or a comedy aficionado, the Xfinity 10G network was made for streaming it all. Worry less about buffering when streaming your favorite shows, movies, or live sports, and enjoy a better way to watch. Xfinity gives you a reliable connection for streaming, plus all the entertainment you love all in one place. Fear not, because now you can finally sit back, relax, and stream your favorite entertainment and sports like never before with the Xfinity 10G network.
Want the same expert advice you get from the pros in the store while shopping online at discounttire.com? Meet Treadwell, your personal online tire guide that matches you with the perfect tire for your vehicle. Get your best match in 1 minute or less with Treadwell by Discount Tire.
Jewelry isn't a gift you give just once. It's a way to remind your loved one of a beautiful moment every time they see it. Blue Nile can help you find the gift that says how you feel and says it beautifully, with expert guidance and a wide assortment of jewelry of the highest quality at the best price. Go to BlueNile.com and experience the convenience of shopping Blue Nile, the original online jeweler since 1999. That's BlueNile.com to find the perfect jewelry gift for any occasion. BlueNile.com.
What does that mean, Kevin?
Business time.
We're here in the business section as we can connote from that business music. Kevin, what is happening on the Crime Writers on After Show for our Patreon listeners right now?
I don't know. We haven't talked about it. I guess we're going to get into... Laura's going to give us an update on Felix the cat.
Oh, Felix.
We have a listener saying, whatever happened to Felix? And so Laura will bring us an update.
I would also like to know, I know that all of you, including me, are watching, listening to other books, other TV shows, other podcasts. We're about to embark on a break. Our listeners might not know this, but we're not going to be here next week making this podcast. It is time for us to do...
We'll have a classic episode, though.
Oh, we will?
Yeah, sure.
All right. It's time for us to go on our annual live holiday break, though. So I'm sure we're all going to be checking out or have been checking out new things. We're going to talk about that in the after show as well. Kevin, what else is happening on our Patreon right now?
Right now, you can listen to part 2 of Laura Bricker's interview with Carol Baskin.
Meow.
By the time we're back, we will have a new episode of Toby Ball's Deep Dive Book Club.
You mean Toby Ball's Deep Dive Book Club.
Yes, exactly. Toby, tell us what you've got coming up.
We are reviewing or discussing a book called The Third Rainbow Girl. This is my Appalachia week. It's about a double murder in West Virginia in the early 1980s, but is also really about sort of the culture of this very poor Appalachian area, where the author spends quite a bit of time basically as a social worker, and she learns about this case. So it's kind of a back and forth between the true crime and sort of her experience there, which is, it's a format I'm not always that crazy about, but I think she does pretty well. But I think it's going to be a pretty interesting discussion. Sarah D. Bunting will be there, and Julia Lowry Henderson.
What a great series. What a great set of guests. Jesus Christ.
I know.
We're getting A-listers for your book club, for the Balls Deep Dive Book Club podcast. I'm really impressed.
We also have a new episode of Married with Podcast.
Yes, it's very personal.
And it's not too late for patrons to sign up for the Crime Writers On Holiday Party. We're going to be doing it on Crowdcast. You remember over the summer we do these, have drinks after work with Kevin.
Yes.
On the computer screen. We bring in people on their computer screen, and we move things around and talk to everybody.
Stop referring to that. In the Dark did a holiday party. We're doing what they did. It's going to be just as cool.
We're doing it better.
Can I come?
Yes. How do people get into the Crime Writers on Holiday Party? How do they get there?
You got to join Patreon. So go to patreon.com/partners in crime media.
What level do you have to be at to get into our holiday party? I'm just curious.
It's open to all patrons.
Really?
Yep.
So even if you're like $5 a month, you get into our holiday party?
$5 a month is the exclusive content club.
Nice.
So yes.
Nice. So basically, like, you could join for a month and then quit.
Right. And I will say also, we're running a special with Patreon that if you sign up or switch your subscription from monthly to annually, if you do an annual membership, you'll get 10% off, and you will get a telephone call from one of the four of us.
Probably Kevin.
Well, everybody's been doing it.
No, and I will tell you, speaking of holiday parties, I spoke with Michelle Womble today, and she was making a dark chocolate peppermint martini for the holidays for a party she was going to with her husband on Zoom. So maybe we can make that. Yeah, I got the recipe. So if you want to do it.
Nice.
Excellent.
Yes, I've become best friends with people that I call Kevin. Have you become best friends with people that you've called?
I would say best friends, but I had a lot of great conversations.
Nice.
And I keep asking people whether we should get rid of Toby, and they say no.
Nobody wants to get rid of Toby.
Start convincing people.
Toby, who do you
keep
ask people? Toby,
just keep asking.
Like, what questions do you ask our listeners, Toby? Are you like, should the podcast get rid of me? I'm just curious.
I just say, would you just listen to it if it was just me?
Yeah.
If it was just me, crime writer.
Yes.
Crime writer.
They're like, yes, it's called Stranger Rivals, and it was a hit podcast
that's right.
that I listened to. Yes.
I don't ask those kinds of questions. I have very pleasant conversations about all kinds of stuff.
Me too.
Actually,
I
do
mostly
ask
talk
questions.
about TV with people.
I
All right,
talk about pets.
So Kevin, who might I ask?
We played a type, in other words.
Exactly. We all played a type for characters. I'm like, what are you watching? What are you drinking? Toby's like, what are you reading? Laura's like, who's your cat? Well, Kevin's like, will you be my best friend?
Nobody I talked to had cats. And today, Buddy the dog interrupted my call because he had been eating cat litter again. So
nice.
You get real life Bricker household experience when I talk to you.
Laura, my beautiful puppy Briscoe ate half a dead bird on our walk this morning, so there was that.
Ew.
All right, Kevin, before we move on, do we have any Patreon patron saints of the week this week?
Our Patreon patron saints are Jennifer Carr and Karen McClellan. Bless you.
Bless you guys.
They were both wonderful to speak to as well.
Thank you to everybody who supports us on Patreon. You can get the Crime Writers on After Show right now at patreon.com/partners in crime media, as well as all of that other content, including Toby's podcast, Laura's podcast, Married with Podcast. It's all awesome. Head on over right now to patreon.com/partners in crime media. And thank you for enduring.
I talked to someone today who lives down the street from my sister.
Oh my God, in Massachusetts?
Yeah, I was like...
Does she also see Benjamin Bratt in the grocery store?
No, she doesn't. She doesn't know Benjamin Bratt lives in that town.
That's crazy.
I had to explain it to her.
Literally down the street?
Yeah.
That's amazing. Is she going to go like stalk your sister now?
Told her not to do that.
Would you recognize Benjamin Bratt if he was in the grocery store?
100%. Are you fucking kidding me, Toby? Listen, I know you're celebrity blonde, but the rest of America
Peruvian drink
is
of
not.
water, you bet.
Toby's celebrity blind. Unless it was like Patrick Radden Keefe, he would have no idea who it was. And thus ends the business section. Kevin, should I fade that music out right now?
If it's still playing.
It's still playing. I've looped it. All right, fading it out. Moving on.
But out of all of my experiences, there is one that stands out from all the rest. This story is a story of the serpent and the spirit.
In 1991, EMTs responding to a call for a snake bite discovered a woman with a disturbing tale. She claimed her jealous husband had tried to kill her with the rattlesnakes he used in his Pentecostal church services.
It was black, the skin was starting to die. That's when I got real concerned because that gets in her bloodstream, it can go to your heart. We've got to get this girl over there in a hurry.
After his conviction, Glenn Summerford told his life story to an Appalachian folklorist. In the HBO Max documentary, Alabama Snake, we see Summerford's hard-knock, hard-drinking life leading up to him fashioning the serpents he used in his religious services as weapons against his wife.
The man was put on trial not for what he did, but for what he stands for serpent handling, the Word of God. And it is the Word of God.
From the filmmakers behind McMillions and The Legend of Cocaine Island, Alabama Snake explores Summerford's backstory, his incredible crime, and the world of Pentecostal ministry and its relationship with snakes. But does it balance what's interesting about those things to create a memorable story? Spoiler alert, we are going to be talking about plot points for Alabama Snake, so to remain spoiler-free, go to the estimated time code in our show notes to hear our thumbs up or thumbs down reviews. Kevin Flynn.
Yeah.
I feel like I had a dream where I watched a documentary about snakes and Alabama and Pentecostal stuff. Was that a dream or was that a real documentary?
It might have been a dream for you because I think you fell asleep on the couch.
But this whole thing was very dreamy, right? The way that it's made?
Yeah, it was. That's a good way of putting it. It has a certain style to it. I was reminded an awful lot, before I knew who the documentarians were, I was reminded an awful lot of The Legend of Cocaine Island. Not just because they had people doing their own reenactments, which I only had seen in that, but there was, sort of this way of telling the story that was very familiar in the way that they did it. It does share some of its stylistic DNA, although not as tongue-in-cheek as Cocaine Island was. But I remember how that one opened up, and it was like, the difference between a northern fairy tale and a southern fairy tale, and it's northern fairy tale starts off once upon a time, southern fairy tale starts off, you ain't gonna believe this shit.
Yeah.
You ain't gonna believe this shit was a little bit of how this started off.
The DNA between this and Cocaine Island are that the actual people involved in the story do recreations in the show, which is crazy because they're way too old.
They only did the EMTs were the only ones who did that.
Toby, I'm just curious about your stylistic notes on this documentary because, like I said, and I'm standing by it, I either felt like I ate a bunch of edibles and then watched it, or had a dream that I watched a documentary about something with snakes and snake bites and religion. Toby, what do you think about the style of this whole thing?
It's not really my cup of tea, I guess. So I'm not 100% sure what he's trying to get after. Some of it's kind of confusing. It's like, do you really need to show like this guy knocking his kid off a log into the water again and again? What are we getting from that just having normal narration wouldn't get? There's a bunch of scenes where it's kind of like, I don't know why I'm watching this, but it at least had some relation to sort of, I guess, somebody's version of reality. And then at the end, there's like that bizarre scene where he's being lifted up out of the water in, in sort of the crucifix position while like a little flicker of flame comes down to baptize him in fire or something. And I guess my thought was,
what the fuck?
Are they trying to represent like his own feeling about what might have happened? But then afterwards, it's like, oh, they found him in a dumpster 45 minutes later.
Yeah.
It's like, wait, what?
There's a lot that was discombobulated, right?
It's discombobulated. And then when you compare that to the actual interviews they have with people, it just, to me, I wouldn't say it seems tasteless, but it seems
Oh,
really...
no. You can say that, Toby, because it is.
It's like a completely different thing, because when you actually talk to the people who are involved, including Glenn's son and his wife or ex-wife, I assume they probably got divorced after he tried to kill her.
The one on the end of the dock, that one?
Yeah. I mean, those are very difficult conversations, right? And it's kind of strange to have these wacky recreations and a tiny bit of tongue-in-cheek stuff. I mean, they start off very tongue-in-cheek with these guys like mawing down some McDonald's in the back of their ambulance before the whole... I mean, that's the opening scene.
Yeah.
Is these two guys sharing Mickey D's in the back of an ambulance. It was all over the place and
Are they
sort
playing
of not
that
in a good way.
scratch-off game? Because, the documentarians
I know,
pull it all together.
But Toby, can I just ask you a question about those interviews? Because this is what I just kept thinking when you talk about tastelessness.
Yeah.
I just kept thinking there's one element that is just kind of ignored in this whole thing, which is like abject poverty. Like, there's a lot of poverty here in this community. And I just found myself thinking, like, we are looking at people who, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of crazy stuff to look at in terms of, like, the snakes and, like, the sort of way they run their churches and the folklore, which is a very real thing, Appalachian, American folklore. But when you said tasteless, that really rung with me, because I just kept thinking of that woman, the ex-wife, like the sitting at the end of the dock, the sort of talking to her. It's like there's a lot of just abuse and poverty that's just sort of like very glossed over. Did you feel that way too?
Yeah, I mean, I don't... So there's a couple different things going on there. One is, I think you get a sense that they were very, very poor, but I don't think you get a sense of why that mattered.
Yeah.
In terms of the whole story. And I can talk later, but I read a book about this same thing, but earlier. I think the book was written just before the whole snakebite thing happened, but it's got the same people and it's in the same place, but does sort of position things and like the effect that poverty has on the people. The second thing is the interview with the wife. I had a real problem with that, in that it seemed as though that was something where they probably should have called a wrap on it and tried it again sometime.
Yeah.
Or decided that it wasn't going to happen, because, there's something going on there, and it was very disturbing. And quite honestly, just even down to the, like, do you consent to be on camera? She didn't seem like she was really in condition to do that for whatever reason.
I prayed for him to die, and the Lord showed me not to do that, because that's wrong. That's wrong to pray for somebody to die. He said I poisoned him one time, but I didn't.
Seemed like she was going to stumble off the dock when she walked away.
Yeah.
I mean, was anybody wondering, like, why they chose that location to do this interview?
I mean, which was exploitative, yeah. It all felt very True Blood, right? I mean, there was actually footage.
On a lake at night,
Yeah.
on a dock. I guess there's no mosquitoes there, right?
There's actually archival footage in this documentary
Looks
that was
very
part
much,
No, it
yeah.
was. I looked it up.
Yeah.
I watched the title sequence for True Blood again. Part of the same archival footage we saw was used in the same, like, sort of like voodoo-y, like weird vampire stuff we see at the beginning of True Blood. Anyway, Laura Bricker, you hate snakes. Go.
Yeah. So how many things have we watched for this podcast? I will tell you, I stepped on a snake when I was about 4 years old with bare feet when I was walking with my grandmother. And I've been absolutely petrified of snakes. Like, I can't even walk by snakes when I go to a pet store when they're in like the glass container. I can't even look at them. So I think I covered my eyes more during this documentary than anything else we've ever watched. Like, I seriously, and then I'd be like, Laura, if you keep looking, it's gonna, like, you're gonna be able to look. And I'm like, I can't look. I can't fucking look. Like, I used to have nightmares about that sequence in Indiana Jones when they like fell into the pit of snakes, and I would have like nightmares about that. So I'm like, oh my God. But I don't think I dislike this as much as you guys did, because I'm really fascinated by this culture of worshiping with the snakes. I don't know. I'm sort of interested in that period in religion where we had the worshiping with the snakes. Like, there was a church. I have a friend who used to church hop. She was very interested in churches. And like back in like the 80s, there was a church near me where the people would be like, I've been overcome by the Holy Spirit. And they would like roll around in the aisles and they'd be like, the holy laughter has taken me over. So I'm sort of interested in that. I don't know. I just find it sort of fascinating the way that different churches take on these different personalities. But the snake thing was, it was pretty terrifying to watch on that archival footage. And I think the fact that we had that archival footage really helped, bring this story to life, even though I couldn't watch half of it because I couldn't stand looking at the snakes. And oh my God, when they went out to get the snakes out of the shed, I almost fucking died. I'm like, oh my God. And that guy's like, well, like the one guy who's there just because like he might have known a little about snakes or something. I'm like, oh my God. And then I'm done with the snake talk. When I was a private investigator, I remember one time I had to go to some trailer park to do an interview. And the people went home and I like looked in the window and it was all dark. And there was like this huge like glass case with this giant snake. And I was like, I'm calling those people on the phone. I am not coming back here.
I guess we know if someone calls pet detective Laura Bricker for a missing snake, whether she's going to take the case or not.
Well, it's so interesting you say that, Kevin, because when I was going through my pet detective school, I had a unit on snakes. And when I had my weekly check-in with my trainer, she's like, well, what did you think about the snake section? I said, well, I won't be doing that.
I don't know. My eyes were closed the whole time.
That's right. They're like, well, because they had this thing where you could like buy this like like this long, like the thing you put down your drain when your drain's clogged, but it had a camera to find snakes.
You know what they call that? They call that a snake.
They do. Right. And I said, I don't need the snake because I will not be searching for snakes.
You don't care. If someone thinks a snake in the house, like call some other pet detective.
Mystery solved.
All set. Yeah. My friend Barbara from the Historical Society, one of Barbara's children, I'm not sure which, had a snake that got loose in their house for like 2 fucking months. I'm like, no way. Nope. Sorry, Barbara. All right,
Kevin,
carry on.
This documentary does something we haven't seen in a lot of documentaries. Jump scares.
Oh my God, there were 3 of them.
What did you think of that?
I was scared. I jumped when they had the scene.
Oh, baby, you jumped?
Where Darlene said that, the demon came to her and then the demon jumped at Glenn.
Yeah.
And he woke up and said, what are you doing? I said, getting that demon out of here. And he said, you ain't rebuked no devil. And I said, yes, I did. And he said, well, call it back in here. And I did. Then he came back and got in.
Yeah, it was spooky. Whoa!
Here's my real question. Do you think this documentary actually explores, really, whether or not this guy tried to murder his wife with a snake? Or is it about a bunch of other things, and that's just like the hook?
There were really 3 kinds of stories happening here. There's the one about the crime. There is, the one about his backstory, his life story, and then there's, the stuff with the church and that Pentecostal
anthropological stuff, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if it did a particularly good job with any of them, and they didn't quite fit together the right way. I mean, I had sort of a problem with the structure where, okay, you start off with the discovery of the crime. You would do that in a crime book, right? But then you go on through and you get, okay, and this is what happened, and an arrest, and then the trial, and he went to jail. Chapter 2. I'm like, well, what the fuck? Then you get the whole backstory.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm not invested in the backstory anymore.
Yeah.
Because I know how this ends.
Yeah.
And then they get to the stuff about the Pentecostal movement, and they don't go in as deep and asking the right kinds of questions that I would have.
It feels like an interesting pairing with actually Forgotten Women of Juárez because they took a murder, like one among hundreds, and they start there, and then they do this like big zoom out, like layered onion situation where you learn so many things. And I feel like I learned very little about anything in this documentary. But Toby, to me, one of the big crimes here is we don't really get, the setup is, did this guy try to kill his wife with a snake? But there's just so little time spent on whether or not this guy tried to kill his wife with a snake, right? Like, it sets up a promise, and then it does a bunch of other stuff, and it doesn't deliver on any of it.
Yeah. You get the sort of he said, she said take on what happened that night. And then with this weird thing where the kid shoots an arrow at him, or there's sometimes
it sounds like you had a dream too, where you maybe watched this documentary.
Well,
Toby.
But there were things where I was like, did that happen? Like, there's a thing where he fights and he knocks both his eyeballs onto his nose or something, and
he fights the other guy and knocks his eyeball out.
Says it again, something else. Yeah.
He did it twice. The other time with vice grips or
Apparently
something.
That's a thing. You like punch somebody and their eyeballs fall out.
It happens all the time. And then But then he like goes home and then his house is set on fire. And I was like, is this supposed to happen on the exact same night? Like,
And he's throwing his kids out the window.
He's throwing his kids out the window. He's got blood all over his face, but it just wasn't clear to me that one followed the other. Anyway, I don't know. I mean, to me, the interesting things about this is you could spend a little bit of time on his backstory. But what was interesting about his backstory, I thought, was the switch he makes from being this, basically a violent criminal guy to becoming this like ultra religious guy. And in his mind, I think he feels absolved of his past sins because of the passion with which he takes up religion. Right. So that's one thing that's kind of interesting. It's like, how does that actually, how does that play? How does that work? Is that at all legitimate? Is it, what's going on there? Another thing that they just touch about just very briefly is about how, the Pentecostals, they talk, I think they call them hill people in the thing. And they say they lived up in the hills and then they've started to come down into town. And that was, I can't remember if it's the EMT or maybe a cop at the beginning, but that was another thing. And in the book I read about it is more of a deal, is that there's really this culture clash between the sort of more quote unquote modern people in the town and then these people who've lived a much more rural existence. And those are the Pentecostals, and they're very, there's a lot of poverty, and you don't really hear, I guess you hear about it a little bit, but their worship services go on all night, they're like 7 or 8 hours.
Yep.
And, speaking in tongues and snakes and drinking strychnine.
We didn't hear that. Yeah, we didn't.
Yeah. So there's actually, if people are interested in this, in the whole Pentecostal stuff, there's a really interesting documentary called The Holy Ghost People that you can watch on YouTube, which was done in the 50s. There's a little bit of my second novel has to do with this stuff about like sort of ecstatic religion. So I did some research, which is why I read this book called Salvation on Sand Mountain. So anyway, I thought there was some stuff that they could have pursued. And the one thing I think they do touch on a little bit is sort of the generational trauma when they talk to his son.
A little bit. I would say a very little bit.
A very little bit. But he, I think he talks about the difficult relationships he has with his parents. For some reason, they make him do it in a cave. But
and then we see him driving his truck because that's how it always is.
That's a choice. Yeah. Oh, and then the other weird thing is when they show the guy who's playing Glenn is in the cave with like that weird light shining on him while he's reading the Bible. So, like, what the hell is going on?
Can I just ask like a real question?
Mm-hmm.
I don't care who answers this. So like Toby touched on this, but a huge part of this story and a lot of stories about these like narcissistic evangelical preacher guys is like a lot of times, and this is not like a knock on actual faith and actual religion, but a lot of these like figures at the top of like these evangelical churches that do things that you don't understand, they're narcissists who are also very bad people. We've seen it over and over and over again. This guy was abusive. He was awful. He was violent. Then he had this quote reformation and becomes this like religious guy. And the documentary basically presents it on its face as like he changed. And I'm like, no, he didn't. He's just channeling that same narcissism and violence and all this other stuff. But now he has more power because he has an audience. I don't know. I don't know who wants to take that up, but I just felt like that was another unexplored thread of how like abusive, narcissistic men, they use reformation and religion to reskin themselves, but it's bullshit. Anyone want to respond to that?
Yeah. So what I was thinking about when I'm looking at him finding religion is like, usually we're seeing people in the things that we review, and when we're seeing somebody that's involved in a crime, somebody doesn't find religion until they go to jail or prison. And I was like, well, this guy's like ahead of the curve because he's found religion before he gets arrested. So for me, that sort of added a little bit more questionability, like gray area of like what actually happened, because I don't necessarily feel like it's sincere. Yeah, he found religion, but he's still doing all this bad shit. But we're supposed to believe that he didn't try to kill his wife because he found religion before he got arrested. So for me, that was sort of where, when I ended this whole documentary, I was like, well, I don't really think I know what actually happened. Like, I didn't come out of it feeling like I had a feeling of like, oh, she definitely got attacked, or she definitely made it up, like he said.
Yeah, I have no idea. I have literally no idea.
But I think
I
that's
didn't even know that was supposed to be a question till the end.
It was a question.
Like, did he murder her with a snake? That was the whole
did he try to kill her with the snake? And so I think because of this sort of, for me, questionable, like, finding God storyline with him, I was like, well, I mean, he found God, but you hear a lot of people that found God still doing some pretty bad things. So anyway, but I have to just say, I love the ending, that last little thing after we have him like floating up into the sky when they're like, and he still is not, or he's still waiting to ascend to heaven or whatever it was. That was like my favorite.
All right. Well, I think we should do what we do. Let's let our listeners know, should they check out Alabama Snake? It's a sort of documentary on HBO Max made by the same people who made things that we really enjoyed. McMillions and
Legend of Cocaine
Island. Laura Bricker, should people check out Alabama Snake? What do you think? Thumbs up or thumbs down?
Wow. I always love going first. So,
you always go first. You'd think you'd be used to it by now.
I am used to it by now.
It's been 6 years.
It has been 6 years. And I'm going to say, I didn't hate this as much as everybody else did. I'm going to give this a mild thumbs up because I found that, yes, there was issues with the way that the storytelling was done. I felt like they did exploit some of the interview subjects that were living in very impoverished areas. But I was just also very fascinated by this whole subculture of the serpent worshiping. And I actually liked the sort of campy setup going into this with the paramedics that respond to the initial crime. I thought it was, I kind of enjoyed the setup. I learned some things. I had to cover my eyes for much of this, but, there was issues with it. But I also was like, we watch so many documentaries. When have we ever watched something like this? That was so, like, I just felt like, how have I not heard about this? So I think that there are issues with it, but I think there's enough. It's only an hour and a half. There's enough things that are interesting about this show that you've got an hour and a half to watch it.
Toby Ball, what about you? Thumbs up or thumbs down for Alabama Snake?
I'm a thumbs down. I didn't really like it. What I would like is to listen to the director on a podcast kind of talking about like choices he made and reasons why he did certain things, because I think that would probably be pretty interesting, because I didn't kind of get it, but it does seem like he definitely makes decisions, right? There's a lot of decisions made with how things are going to be portrayed and what's going to be portrayed and things like that. And I'd just be interested in how that all was thought out. But
so basically you just want to say, like, what the fuck were you thinking? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but not in the way where sometimes it's just like this thing just like was
not
awful.
Mean. Yeah.
I'm like kind of interested because whatever it was, I don't think I got it. And I don't know. It's just a thumbs down. I didn't get much out of it.
Kevin Flynn.
Yeah, I'm also a thumbs down. I didn't feel like I understood anything about this protagonist. What was motivating him, what he actually wanted, and I mean, they're just I don't even really know. I think that they wanted this to be somewhat quirky. It wasn't. He wanted it to be visually interesting. Kind of was, but as far as a really great story, no. And the final scene is just fucking ridiculous. I just laughed out loud, and all of a sudden, if I were on the fence, I saw that and I just laughed out loud. This is so fucking bad. So thumbs down.
Yeah, thumbs down for me too. So I liked Legend of Cocaine Island and McMillions because they were both, hey, get a load of this documentaries, right? It was like, hey, get a load of this. You're never going to believe this shit. Like, that is the theme, right? And then it basically is just a yarn, a crazy fucking yarn told in a really creative way with real people doing their own recreations and a lot of like fun, stylized. Remember in McMillions, Kevin, they had the woman who worked at McDonald's and they had like the flashback and they exactly recreated her outfits. And it was just like very cheesy in a good way, kitschy.
I talked about how great the coffee was in the lobby and he's carrying the coffee.
So I just feel like this story is too high stakes and dark to treat that way. I mean, really, we're talking about did he or didn't he try to kill his wife with a snake? If that were just it, if it were just some weird guy who maybe or maybe didn't try to kill his wife with a snake, maybe you could tell it that way. But this really has very, very much darker and deeper issues at its core. It's about poverty. It's about sort of the Appalachian otherness of these sort of subcultures of this huge part of the United States that we never talk about. There's a lot of violence against women. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of child abuse. And I just don't think it's a fun enough story to treat in this way. I felt people in it were being exploited, and I felt like the story, given this treatment, didn't land. But most of all, I don't remember enough about this documentary because it gave me the feeling that I had a dream where I once watched a documentary about this thing, and that's just tough. It's tough to feel that way about a thing that I watched, not in a good way. Queen's Gambit also felt like a dream, but in a good way. This felt like a dream in a not good way. So thumbs down for me.
Whether you're a diehard sports fan, a hopeless romantic, or a comedy aficionado, the Xfinity 10G network was made for streaming it all. Worry less about buffering when streaming your favorite shows, movies, or live sports and enjoy a better way to watch. Xfinity gives you a reliable connection for streaming plus all the entertainment you love all in one place. Fear not, because now you can finally sit back, relax, and stream your favorite entertainment and sports like never before with the Xfinity 10G network.
Want the same expert advice you get from the pros in the store while shopping online at discounttire.com? Meet Treadwell, your personal online tire guide that matches you with the perfect tire for your vehicle. Get your best match in 1 minute or less with Treadwell by Discount Tire.
Jewelry isn't a gift you give just once. It's a way to remind your loved one of a beautiful moment every time they see it. Blue Nile can help you find the gift that says how you feel and says it beautifully, with expert guidance and a wide assortment of jewelry of the highest quality at the best price. Go to BlueNile.com and experience the convenience of shopping Blue Nile, the original online jeweler since 1999. That's BlueNile.com to find the perfect jewelry gift for any occasion. BlueNile.com.
Me. Now it's time for my favorite part of the podcast, a little something I like to call the crime of the week. An Australian lawyer has lost his bid to keep his vanity license plate. Peter Levac drives a yellow Lamborghini with the plate LGOPNR, which spells out, leg opener.
Yeah, it does.
Despite several legal appeals, New South Wales officials have canceled his registration and seized the tags. They say it's offensive. They're right, by the way. While someone might think driving a $500,000 sports car will open some legs, Levac says it's just a cheeky nod to his public persona. The, get this, 74-year-old playboy, older than your mom, by the way, Kevin, prosecuted gangs in Hong Kong and dates much younger fashion models. Good for you, douchebag. If the government thought the license plate was so offensive, we're not sure how we got it in the first place. But any ladies' man should know speed isn't everything. It's all about how you handle a stick. The motion of the ocean, as they say, Kevin. So, panel,
it's
Peter...
It's not a speedboat. It's a speed car.
Peter feels like he needs to get his Lambo back on the road. Give this very fucking old playboy a new vanity plate. Laura Bricker, I'm going to start with you.
DCHBAG.
Perfect. Douchebag. All right, Toby Ball, what about you? What vanity plate would you give this guy?
Chlamydia.
Kevin?
Yeah, it would be P too slow. His prostate, right? Yeah.
I would just say ED, because clearly this guy suffers from some really fucking bad erectile dysfunction, right?
Yeah.
If you got a car like that, yeah.
Yeah, all right. So we should probably end on that note before we do. By the way, that guy, he can go fuck himself. Laura Bricker, do we have a cat of the week this week?
So we have a dog of the week this week, Rebecca.
Yes!
Our regular listener and frequent sounder inner on our various discussion groups, La Brea, This one, I felt like we needed a nice one this week. I had some other nominations, but they were a little more sad, and this was very uplifting.
No more dead animals, guys. We need a break.
This is our holiday week episode. We needed an uplifting thing. Thank you, La Brea, coming through for us. So she says she wants to preface her story by saying she works with kids and teens on the autism spectrum. One of the families I work with recently adopted a pregnant dog, and they kept one puppy, and they named him Happy. The name fits him so perfectly because he's the happiest dog I've ever met. He's the sweetest, gentlest, big-headed dog ever. He's so cute, and he is so excited to see everyone. He just wags his tail and lays on his back for belly rubs. So the child is pretty indifferent to the dogs, and you wouldn't really think there was a connection between them. On Sunday, the grandfather of the child took him and Happy on a hike. The kid has a history of elopement, and on Sunday, he eloped from his grandfather. Since Happy is such a good dog, he usually walks off leash. Happy took off after the kid. 0.5 miles and an hour later, the kid and Happy were found safe. They traversed through the woods over a couple of fences. Happy stayed with him the whole way.
Oh, Happy.
He wasn't trained to do this. They hadn't even thought of training him in this way, but the story just touched her because she thought it shows how amazing animals are and how we don't deserve them.
We don't.
Oh, it was wonderful. Being the emotional person I am, I cried happy tears and wanted to share with my CWO family. And she sent some pictures of the dog with his big head.
Listen, I have a big-headed, super dopey dog that follows me everywhere. Happy, I'm with you. You are clearly way better than a guy who maybe murdered his wife with a snake. So I love everything about the story.
Is that the bar these days?
It is. Laura Bricker, if people want to pitch to you their dogs to be cat of the week, or of course their cats too, how can they find you on Twitter?
At Laura Bricker.
And of course, you can also pitch your animals to be cat of the week. It doesn't have to be a cat or a dog at crimewriterson@gmail.com. Toby Ball, folks want to reach out to you and say, I agree with all of your opinions, Toby Ball. How can they find you on Twitter?
Anytime, day or night, at Toby Ball NH.
And Ken Flynn, if folks want to reach out to you and say, how do you live with a woman who interrupts you so often? How can they find you on Twitter?
I'm at Kevin P. Flynn.
It's okay. They're just reaching out to me and saying that I interrupt you too often. So don't worry about it. You'll never get that tweet.
Okay.
And if you want to follow me on Twitter or Instagram, you can find me at Reb Lavoie. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Crime Writers On, and I strenuously encourage you to join our amazing community and our official Crime Writers On Facebook discussion group. We also have a regular old Facebook page, and that's fine, but the group is awesome. Support this show at patreon.com/Partners in Crime Media. You will get the Crime Writers On After Show right now. Plus, Married with Podcast, Toby Ball's Deep Dive Book Club podcast, and Laura Bricker's Leave It to Bricker podcast. Our theme song was composed and performed by Ty Gibbons. Our line editor is the very handsome Olivia Burdett. Our executive producer is Kevin Flynn. This show was recorded in the Yoga Loft above the Bodega in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi studio, otherwise known as Studio C, the teeny tiny little closet in our basement where we keep rattlesnakes just to murder people. On behalf of all the crime writers, thanks so much for listening. We will catch you later.
So I was like, I'm going to take the wheelbarrow and get a bunch of wood before the big storm. Well, the freaking latch on this heavy metal wood box broke, and I didn't know it. So I had it popped open, and I'm putting wood in and stacking it, and like fell on the side of my head. And I'm like, man.
Are you okay?
My head's a little, so if I'm a little goofy, that's why. Yeah, and Ken's just like, oh.
Are you
I'm
accidentally
like,
going to give this Alabama snake thing a good review now?
No. I said I could have died. You
could have.
I could have, like, decapitated
what
myself.
What a shitty way to
was
die
just
that
like,
would be.
I know, in the wood box. Seriously.
But you'd end up like half of you would be in the wood box and the thing would be over you. And there'd be a lot of questions.
There'd be a lot of
There'd
questions.
be questions about time of death because part of me would be frozen and part of me wouldn't be frozen.
I got to get Madison Hamburg on that.
And then people would be yelling at Hugh Grant about, like, did he do it? Is he too charming to be a murderer?
Madison Hamburg would be secretly taping all of Laura's relatives.
Amber Hunt would get her interns to like build a exact scale model of the wood box.
Parker
and then make them
Yesko
would stick their bodies into it. And
Parker
then slam it
Yesko
down
would
on
be
top
like,
of them.
Doing data journalism.
Did you do it? Did you do it, Woodbox? Did you do it? And the Woodbox would be like, no, I did your mother, though. It would be a whole thing.
Laura would appear in Ken's head, working out the different clues in the case.
Oh, my God.
Partners in Crime Media.
Want the same expert advice you get from the pros in the store while shopping online at discounttire.com? Meet Treadwell, your personal online tire guide that matches you with the perfect tire for your vehicle. Get your best match in 1 minute or less with Treadwell by Discount Tire.